When you think of Victorian London, what do you picture? Prudish women in bodices, bustles and long velvet dresses? Sherlock Holmes? Steam engines? Well, you wouldn't be wrong, but there was a lot going on in Victorian times. In 1888, London was the largest and the richest city in the world. So although these impressions were true for some parts of West London, the East End of London was a different story entirely. How did London come to be so divided from the poor East and the rich West? And did the conditions in the East End of London create the perfect environment for Jack the Ripper? And should this change how we view the phenomenon? Victorian Britain was a period where so many things changed, it's difficult to pinpoint anything specific or fashion them into any kind of order because they all affect one another. So as far as wealth disparity, this is often the case with most cities, and London, being one of the largest, is no different. London was founded by the Roman armies on the north bank of the River Thames in 43 AD. And during their occupation, they built a fortification wall around the city. And this wall was damaged and rebuilt several times, amending the boundaries of the city as it grew. And this became the City of London. And with all cities comes waste. You know the kind of waste I'm talking about. And that is generally dumped in the rivers and the sea. And in the case of London, because the east is closer to the sea, waste was dumped there for hundreds of years. And obviously those with money who can choose where they live aren't going to choose the areas that have the waste flowing through them. And for the same reason, businesses such as tanneries and fabric dyeing, both of which use urine and produce unsavoury smells, were also set up in the east, downwind of the west, to keep the smell away. And this was the case as early as medieval times. The docks, of course, were in the east, and so those areas attracted dock workers. And so the people who work in those industries live close by, near the work. And as the population grows, the poor move to where they can afford, i.e. in the east, and close to the work. And those that are more wealthier settle in the more attractive, appealing areas, the west. And as there have always been more poor than rich, the East End areas become overcrowded. And at the time of the Whitechapel murders, the East End of London was particularly overcrowded, and there are several reasons for this. By then, the Industrial Revolution was well underway, and during this time the economy changed from being farming-based to industry-based. The epicentres of industry are the larger cities, and at that time, London in particular, where factories, mills, warehouses are located, so there was movement from rural areas to London. And of course the majority of the factories, mills and warehouses were in the East End, away from the privileged in the West. And there was also external migration. The potato famine in Ireland saw thousands of families fleeing the country to escape starvation. They settled worldwide, but notably they also settled in London. And not long before the murders, a huge community of Jewish families, numbering in the thousands, had settled in London to escape persecution and famine in Eastern Europe. And this resulted in a huge anti-Semitic sentiment there. So it becomes a cycle: more people, more waste, less jobs, less housing, more poverty. In the East End, sanitation was appalling. They did have outdoor toilets, but not many, and they were far outnumbered by the chamber pot. And these were mostly emptied into the streets. So sewage ran down the streets where children played, often barefoot. There was refuse everywhere. Chimneys spat out black smoke into the already dirty air, and everything was covered in soot. Those lucky enough to have a home, and I do use that term loosely, often lived with an entire family cramped into one room. Often 2, 3 and 4 families cramped to a room, often sleeping on bare floors. You can imagine the noise, the smell, the lack of privacy, the lack of sanitation. These buildings were squalid slums, old and run down, full of damp, mould, fleas, rats, bedbugs. In the winter it was damp and bitter cold, and in the summer it stunk. Those not so lucky lived in common lodging houses, termed doss houses, paying a few pennies on a nightly basis to share a room with others, often in wooden boxes resembling coffins. Those who couldn't even scrape together the few pennies needed for a bed slept rough wherever they could find. But the truly desperate, with no home to go to, unable to find any pennies for the night, and too old or ill to survive a night's sleeping rough, turned themselves into the workhouse. And the workhouse was truly the last resort. They were made so unpleasant by the parishes running them to prevent what they believed were the lazy poor taking advantage of and relying on public money. Upon admission to the workhouse, families were separated, male from female, adults from children. They were forced to bathe in the water that all of the other intakes had bathed in earlier that day. Deloused and put into uncomfortable workhouse uniforms. They were fed enough poor quality food to keep them alive, and the inmates were constantly hungry, and they were forced to perform labour-intensive jobs such as unpicking old rope and breaking stones. And nights were no better. There was no privacy, with inmates staying in large dormitory wards, sleeping in uncomfortable beds. There was violence from other inmates and also from the wardens there to supposedly protect them. It was unbearable, humiliating, and looked down on. And prospects for employment weren't what they are today. Most jobs related to the Industrial Revolution. Employment was precarious and competition was high. Those fortunate to obtain work faced long hours and dangerous conditions for a meagre wage. Accidents, both serious and fatal, were common, and there was often not much money left after paying rent for the slum accommodations. There was no reliable birth control, and growing families added to the financial strain. Infant mortality was so high that a third of babies born at that time weren't expected to reach the 5th birthdays. Those who did survive had rickets and malnutrition to look forward to, and with no vaccines, children often died of diseases often not fatal today, along with diseases such as typhus, cholera, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis, spread facilitated by the lack of healthcare, dirty water, and overcrowding. As soon as they were old enough, children were sent to work. The 1833 Factory Act made schooling compulsory for 2 hours a day, and the 1844 Factory Act reduced the hours that women and children under 18 could work to only 10 hours a day. These are still really long hours for me, but especially for children, and it wasn't until the 1933 Factory Act that children under 13 were banned from working anything but light duties. So this work was hard, it was long hours and it was dangerous conditions, but families were desperate. An additional wage, even from a child, might mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Even families in a relatively good position for the time faced having the rug pulled out from under them at any time. An injured husband who couldn't work meant no wage. No wage meant no rent, no food, no way to heat the home. A family could be destitute in a matter of weeks, and if the husband died, there was no going back. A woman could never hope to bring in a regular wage, particularly with children to care for. In 1888, equal rights for women were still many, many years away. Women might obtain a job in domestic service, but these jobs meant long hours, and they were generally considered the jobs of single women, not those with sick husbands and children. They might scrape a little money together by selling crochet work, flowers, taking in laundry, or doing sewing, but that wasn't usually enough even to pay the rent, let alone buy food, candles, coal to keep warm. And so as a result, women were forced to sell themselves. If not full time, occasionally, the only thing left to do to feed themselves and their children. The going rate was a couple of pennies, and in some cases even a loaf of bread. So the residents of the East End of London had hard lives. A lot of the residents drank, and I suspect a part of this was to forget about how difficult their lives were, even if just for a while. They did what they could to survive. Violence and robbery was commonplace. The police force were a relatively new organisation, having only been founded in 1829, and they were extremely unpopular with Londoners who felt that they were interfering in their lives, and they themselves often faced abuse. And there were too few to make much difference anyway. The point I'm trying to make is that times were different. We can't conceive of what these people went through and the hardships they faced. They were a product of the time, created by circumstance, and of the rich, many of whom profited from the poor in the East End. So proud of themselves and the Victorian morals, because it's easy to be moral when you're rich, isn't it? Or at least give off the impression of it. And unbelievably, they judged the people in the East End. They felt they were inferior, lazy, considered them to be lesser people than they were. Absolutely clueless. Or maybe they just didn't care. Some areas of East London were worse than others, and these were termed rookeries, the worst of the slums, full of doss houses. For example, Flower and Dean Street, which is referred to a lot in the Jack the Ripper case. Everyone was at risk of violence. The women forced to walk the streets, unfortunate, they knew they risked violence. They drank, partly to forget, probably, but also because they believed that gin prevented pregnancy, and many lost everything to it, and gin was given the nickname Mother's Ruin. As well as risking violence, they risked their lives. They knew there was a murderer and they went out anyway, into dimly lit streets, down dark alleyways with men they didn't know, because they had no choice. So there's been a lot of discussion in recent years as to whether the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper were in fact sex workers. The 5, written in 2019 by Hallie Rubenhold, claims that aside from Mary Jane Kelly, the other 4 canonical victims, that is, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, weren't sex workers, but were actually rough sleepers. And she could be right, they may not have been, but they were described as such by the contemporaries, and the fact is that women selling themselves in East London was so common, so often resorted to, it was a large part of life and survival for women in the East End. Referring to them as sex workers doesn't make them lesser women. It doesn't mean that they were more deserving of what happened to them. It meant that they would do anything that they could to survive. More could have been done for these women. In the next video I'll be talking about the canonical 5. Who were they? And why are they considered to be separate from the other Whitechapel murder victims? I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.